Friday, March 3. In the conquest of Jericho, Achan was not the only man carrying silver and gold back to the camp of Israel. Joshua had told the men to bring back the silver and gold and vessels of brass and iron to the treasury of the house of God, as we read in Joshua 6, verses 19 and 24. Verse 19, but all the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. And verse 24, but they burned the city and all that was in it with fire. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. Everything else was to be burned. Achan, however, was the only man to keep something for himself. We read in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 496, of the millions of Israel, there was but one man who, in that solemn hour of triumph and judgment, had dared to transgress the command of God. Achan's covetousness was excited by the sight of that costly robe of Shinar. Even when it had brought him face to face with death, he called it a goodly Babylonish garment. One sin can lead to another, and he appropriated the gold and silver devoted to the treasury of the Lord. He robbed God of the firstfruits of the land of Canaan. End of quote. In Paul's list of signs of the last days, the first two items involve our attitude toward money and possessions. But know this, he writes in 2 Timothy 3:1 and 2, that in the last days perilous times will come. Men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, or covetous. Selfishness and love of money are significant descriptions of humanity in the last days, our day. And that brings us to our three discussion questions for this week. 1. Read 1 Timothy 6, verses 6 to 10. Now godliness and contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. In class, talk about examples of those who, because of the love of money, have pierced themselves and others through with many sorrows. There are lots of examples, aren't there? How can we find the right balance, knowing that we need money to get by, but not falling into the trap Paul warns about here? 2. What are other things beside money that we can covet? 3. What is the difference between a legitimate desire for something and covetousness? When might a legitimate desire for something turn into covetousness? And now it's time for our mission story for this week, read by my niece Sibylla, who, like me, is also a volunteer. Thank you, Sibylla.
Boldly Sharing Jesus by Andrew McChesney. On an Easter Sunday, retired pastor Simo Vekavuri stood in a packed train travelling home to the capital, Helsinki, from evangelistic meetings that he had conducted in central Finland. A 24-year-old university student boarded the train and looked around for a seat. Even though the train looks full, why don't you walk through the cars and see whether you can find an empty seat, Simo said to her. She returned, smiling. I found 2 free seats, she said, one for me and one for you. Come with me. The two sat opposite each other. Excuse me, but do you mind if I ask you how you feel about religion? Simo asked. I'm quite far from spiritual things right now, she said. Would you like to know how I became a believer? Simo asked. She did, and Simo told her. As the train approached Helsinki, he said, Would you mind if I remembered you in my prayers? The student burst into tears. The tears flowed down her cheeks, and she said loudly, That would be really great. Please do that. Before parting ways, Simo said something that he often tells new friends. May you be encouraged to know that even though you are very busy, you can serve a risen Jesus Christ, the one who atoned for our sins on the cross of Calvary. And that's not all. This same Jesus has promised to come back and will take us to a heavenly home where eternity will start. So, dear friend, let us stay on the heaven-bound journey under the Father's loving hand until we reach our destination. May the Lord bless you through his grace. On another train trip, Simo was surprised when a woman greeted him and even shook his hand as he boarded. "Hello, I'm a retired Seventh-day Adventist pastor," he replied. "Well, that's interesting," the woman said. "I have never heard about Adventists. I want to hear all about your church on this 500-kilometre or 300-mile trip." Here were 2 empty seats. "Let's sit together." Simo spoke about the Adventist church for the whole trip. As they left the train, a man walked up behind him. "Thank you for the interesting train ride," he said, eagerly grabbing Simo's hand with both of his hands. "Thank you for being so brave to share God so loudly that all of us could hear." At 84, Simo seeks divine appointments on every train. "The older I get, the bolder I get in sharing Jesus," he said. This mission story illustrates spiritual growth objective number 5 of the Seventh-day Adventist Church's I Will Go strategic plan, to disciple individuals and families into spirit-filled lives. Read more on iwillgo2020.org. Read more about Simo next week.
This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful. And here is a disclaimer. Contents of these lessons are not intended to be financial advice, but is general commentary based on biblical principles. The reader is encouraged to seek competent professional advice which will suit their particular personal situation.